Greetings, everyone. I hope you are all ready to return to ashes. For when we return to the ashes, we arise a bigger, brighter, better person in the morning. Tonight, I will be featuring a special guest, a very dear friend of mine, the Grim Reaper's Nightmare. He will read the very first story, and I will read the next 7. If you are ready, we are ready. Let's get started, shall we? Here are 8 true Backwoods creepy stories.
In May 2009, I had just broken up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto and were still stuck living together after the breakup, as we didn't know many people in the city yet. Needless to say, the situation was pretty stressful and upsetting. So, when a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend of camping and fishing, I jumped at the chance. He grew up in an area an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful. Loads of lush forests, farmers' fields, and small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along a creek called Grindstone Creek. It's close to some wetlands, and the fishing is supposed to be great. We ended up setting our camp up in what was probably a farmer's field. I'm guessing it was trespassing on our part, to be honest. It was bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, shooting the shit, and drinking some quality craft beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. All in all, it was a really good night. We turned in just after midnight. We shared a tent. My buddy fell asleep before me, and I stayed up playing on my phone until probably around 1:30. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was being woken up by a high-pitched yipping type noise. I was kinda groggy, and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was incessant, and it sounded like a weird coyote. I laid there for a moment listening, then started playing on my phone again. The noise was annoying as hell. I tried to ignore it, but the sound seemed to be getting closer. Finally, it sounded like it was less than 10 feet from the tent. At this point, I was getting a little unsettled. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before, and I thought of them as pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a smallish dog, but what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food? I have pretty bad anxiety disorder, so I'm prone to worrying about these types of things. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake, and he was. The noise had woken him up too. We discussed what to do about the coyote, as we hadn't brought anything to scare off critters. Not a BB gun, nothing. Finally, he decided that he would shine the flashlight on it and holler a lot, hopefully scaring it away. He unzipped the tent, and I watched him pointing the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. His legs suddenly went all wobbly, and he sort of stumbled backwards into the tent. He had a really dumbfounded look on his face when he looked at me and babbled, It's not a coyote, it's a dude, it's some weird dude." Normally, I would have thought that he was messing with me, as I am a huge wimp that is easily scared. I mean, I don't even watch horror movies, but I've never seen someone look that scared, and I never want to see that expression on someone's face again. I knew he wasn't pulling my leg. The weird yipping and howling type noises were still going on, and in retrospect, it didn't really sound like a coyote, but I guess in our groggy states, it was a way for our brains to make sense of it all. Anyway, he kept telling me to just look out. check outside of the flap just to make sure that he's not crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing. I felt like shit, but I had to look. So I slowly peeked out the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust, and that's when I saw him. He was standing only a few arms' length away from the tent. He was swaying a little and wearing a baseball cap. What made it awful, though, what was really creepy, was that he was wearing women's lingerie. That's when I knew there was most likely something very wrong with this guy. If the making high-pitched noises at strangers in a tent in the middle of the night didn't give it away. After I pulled my head back inside the tent, my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at the guy to fuck off. My buddy started yelling, "Excuse me, can you fuck off? We're trying to sleep in here." The noise stopped. It was dead silent, and that's when we heard footsteps running towards the tent. They stopped right outside the tent, but we didn't waste any time. We started yelling again. This time we made mention of our cell phones and told them if they didn't leave that we would call the police. With that, we heard him walk away by the tent and head off. It sounded like he was moving towards the road. Needless to say, we laid awake, petrified until the first sign of sunlight. Then we hightailed it the hell out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home and were both pretty embarrassed about how scared we had gotten. It definitely wasn't manly on either of our parts. I think because we were both ashamed on how we let some weirdo freak us out so much. We really haven't spoken about it since that day. So, here you go. This was my weird story. I'll always wonder what the hell that guy was doing out there or what was wrong with him. Sometimes I wonder if things would have turned out differently if we were a couple of girls. I'm not saying he was some serial killer, but seemed like he was testing who was in the tent. I guess I'll never know, and for that I'm kind of glad.
A few years back, my girlfriend and I, having hiked several other parts of the Appalachian Trail, decided we wanted to give the southern portion of Virginia's trail a shot. It is about 166 miles long and runs through George Washington and Jefferson natural forests from Roanoke County to Pearisburg and Giles County. This is definitely one of the more remote and less traveled parts of the trail, which is exactly what we were looking for. We gathered our gear and made our way to the start of the Virginia Creeper Trail to begin our journey. We had planned our journey to end at Damascus and figured that by the time we got there, we would be more than ready to get home to our own beds. It was early October, and the changing of the leaves and colors were amazing. The air was crisp and cool. Perfect hiking weather with beautiful scenery. The majority of the trip was pretty uneventful. Just your typical hike, but our last couple of nights is where things got weird. On this portion of the trail, you were supposed to camp on the trail or a designated shelter. We didn't really want to run into other people and didn't want anyone coming up on us in the middle of the night. We decided to ignore those suggestions and find our own little spot off the trail. A little searching around, and we found a spot a little ways off the trail in the middle of a small clearing. It was perfect. We set up camp, cooked some food, talked for a while, then snuggled up and went to sleep for the night. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I was awoke by my girlfriend shaking me awake, telling me, "Get your gun. Someone is outside, walking around our tent." She informed me that she woke up to what sounded like someone right outside the tent, running a knife or something along the side while circling us. When hiking, I carry a 1911 and a judge with me. You never know exactly who or what you might run into when on such a long hike in a remote location. I got the judge out of my back, and then we sat silently listening for any sounds. A few minutes of nothing but the breeze blowing through the trees, and then I heard it. Snap, crunch, snap. Someone, or something, walking in the woods behind our tent. I got the flashlight and silently made my way out of the tent. Our fire had went out, so it was nearly pitch black, illuminated by only the dim glow of the October moon. I told my girlfriend to stay put while I checked it out. I didn't flick the flashlight on right away, so as not to give away that I was out of the tent and have it become a shining beacon of my location. Instead, I waited to hear more noises. After a few minutes, snap, crunch, crack. It sounded like it was bipedal based on the way the steps were paced. I turned on the flashlight and flooded the area with light. I thought I saw someone move behind a tree. I yelled out and told them to go away and that I was armed. I kept the light on the area with my gun drawn and slowly approached towards the area where I thought I saw the figure. Then, from my right, I hear what sounds like someone running away through the woods. I spin and face my light that way, and then from the original spot, hear who or whatever was there take off into the woods. There's no way I am giving chase, so I return to the campsite. I tell my girlfriend about what happened, and I end up sitting guard outside the tent, in the darkness, until daybreak. In the morning, I look around a bit for signs of who or whatever it was, and I discovered a boot print and some soft moist dirt not far from our tent. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't my girl's. This freaked me out as it confirmed that someone, perhaps more than one, was skulking around our tent in the dark. I kept it to myself because I didn't want to freak my girl out any more than she already was. At this point, we were pretty deep in and still had 2 days left. That day, we walked a little faster than normal and covered as much ground as possible. When it came time to set up camp, I found a spot near a cliff where we could place the tent in a small overhang and prevent anyone from coming up behind us. The whole day up to this point, I had a feeling we were being followed. I had no confirmation of this as I hadn't seen or heard anyone else, but it was just a gut feeling. We set up camp and made some food, then retreated to the tent. I gave my girl the 1911, and I kept the judge right next to me, and I assured her that if I slept at all, it would be with me with one eye open. After a while, she drifted off to sleep and I stayed awake listening to the sound of the woods at night. I was awake for a few hours, just waiting to see if anything was going to happen. At some point, I guess my exhaustion caught up with me and I drifted off. I awoke sometime later to what sounded like someone going through our stuff outside the tent. I grabbed my gun and woke my girlfriend, shushing her to be quiet. From the faint glow of the fire, I could see someone's silhouette against the tent. There was really someone out there. I yelled out to them something along the lines of, "We are armed. Get the F out of here." They dropped what they were doing and bolted. I came out of the tent, gun drawn and ready to shoot someone. Our stuff was strewn all about. They had rummaged through quite a bit of our stuff. I walked to the edge of the woods in the direction whoever was out there had fled. There was a creek nearby and I walked to the edge, where there was a small trail running alongside it. Down the creek I could see a light. It looked like a lantern the way it flickered. Then I saw 3 more emerge from the other side of the woods. I told my girlfriend to start packing up whatever she could and that we were leaving. Now. We packed up everything of value, left the tent and a few other items, and headed back onto the trail in the middle of the night. I kept hearing people talking off in the woods and hearing branches snap for quite some ways. I kept looking behind us every few seconds to make sure nobody was coming up on us. It was completely nerve-wracking. If something happened, we were still a long ways from anywhere and quite literally on our own, since we hadn't seen another hiker the entire time we had been out there. I really felt we were in serious danger. We had been walking for quite some time when I heard something in the woods behind us. As we rounded a corner, I turned around and saw someone step out onto the trail and just stand there watching us. It was just as the sun was coming up and barely any light. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette. I stopped and looked at them for a second and asked them who they were and what they wanted. They just stood there silently, watching us, and then turned and walked back into the woods. We picked up the pace and kept going, looking back every so often. We didn't see them again, but my gut told me they were still there for quite a ways. We eventually reached the end of the trail and got to where we had parked my girlfriend's car, extremely exhausted. We made it out of the Virginia woods without becoming a meal for a clan of cannibalistic inbred hillbillies, which is what I pictured happening in my head the whole time. I have no idea who they were or what they wanted. Maybe it was just someone messing with us. Maybe it really was a clan of deformed hillbillies who were hunting us. I will never know, because I will not be returning to find out. Does anyone else find the desert extremely creepy? I've driven through and hiked the desert quite a few times, mostly with my husband and a few times with other family members, and I've driven through it alone. We've encountered a dark, disturbing feeling several times. Despite this, my husband likes the desert. With few exceptions, I don't. Even areas of amazing natural beauty often feel unwelcoming. My husband and I were driving through a secluded canyon when we saw a very large cave entrance up ahead. I remarked that it's too bad we can never access things like this when, surprise, there was a dirt road that turned off in the direction of the cave. We parked in a little open area, hiked across a dry stream, and started along a trail that followed the bottom of a ridgeline. This meant we were approaching the cave entrance from the side rather than straight on, and it wasn't immediately visible. We had rounded a bend and could now see the cave through the trees when I was suddenly overwhelmed with a feeling of danger. It was a "get out now, run for your life" sensation. I told my husband, who later informed me he felt it too, at a lesser extent, and we immediately turned back. Like a couple of idiots, we hadn't taken any protection with us, and I kept expecting an attack from behind, but we made it back safely. In that same canyon, we stopped at another place and walked a short distance back into some rocks, where my husband felt such a disturbing feeling that he waited for me by the SUV while I took pictures. Canyons or washes with steep walls are the worst. During a hike through one of them to look at petroglyphs, there was this dark, foreboding energy the whole time. While we've encountered these sensations in other places, the desert takes first prize. In the summer of 2012, I took a job as an expedition canoe guide on the boundary waters in northern Minnesota and southern Ontario. There are a massive wilderness area of lakes and land. I was working for the Boy Scouts, and we were based on Moose Lake on the U.S. side. My job was to facilitate a fun and safe multi-day trip, anywhere from 7 to 12 days out. Most of that summer was typical, but one expedition in particular still haunts me as a result of what happened to us over the course of a few days. Here is the account in full. My crew was on the younger side. There were 9 of us total, the maximum allowed in a group per our permit. There were 6 scouts, 2 adult advisors, or scoutmasters, and myself. They had wanted to do a 200-miler, but didn't have the physical ability, so we had to amend our route. They were bummed out, so I decided to take them to a waterfall called Eddy Falls. It's pretty flat up there, so a waterfall is somewhat rare, but that decision would end up putting us in the path of something. We visited the falls and camped near to it. That evening, I had the boys working on camp set up while the advisors worked on fire for dinner. I was collecting firewood in a big tangle of downed trees, brush, and bramble. I could faintly hear the falls off to my left when out of nowhere, I hear the most unearthly scream, or roar, I've ever heard. It stopped me dead in my tracks, and I was frozen. The second scream was closer, and the third, even closer. I couldn't see anything due to the thickness of the brush, but whatever this was, it was coming directly at me. By the fourth scream, I could feel it in my chest. I got nauseous and involuntarily barked at it. I've never before or since heard that sound come out of my body. The fifth scream almost physically hurt, but it snapped me back to reality and I ran back to camp. My crew had heard it too, but what am I to tell them? I claimed it was a boar. There's no boar up there, and the advisors knew I was lying, but didn't call my bluff. After dinner, they went to their tents and I retired to my hammock, about 50 yards from camp. As a rule, I always set up my hammock at my head height, so about 6 feet up. I would use a tarp over my body and head to keep the morning dew off and the morning mosquitoes at bay. but the tarp wasn't strung up. That's important. It was just loosely over me. It must have been around 3 to 4 a.m. when I was awakened by what sounded to me like a woman sobbing. Not an outright cry, but a sob. At the same time, I'm hearing something walking through the thick brush down past my feet. So I listen, totally still and quiet, as it crosses into camp. I could hear the change from brush to granite rock, but could still hear its heavy footfalls as it walked right through camp and on towards me. At this point, the tarp is still over my head, so I can't see a thing, and I don't know what to do. In no time, it was standing right next to me. I could hear the breathing, loud and congested sounding. I could smell the musk. I could feel its enormous presence only inches from my body. Just standing there. Time to make a decision. I suddenly threw the tarp off my head, and as I did this, my left hand touched this thing in the chest. It was dark, but I could make out briefly a very large upright figure. The hair on it was long and coarse. The musculature was impressive. Bodybuilder status, pectoral, is what I touched. It all happened in a second, and as soon as my hand made contact, it bolted back into the brush with immense speed for such thick debris. By the time I got my headlamp on, it was gone. My crew had slept through it, so I read until the sun came up, and I decided not to mention it. The next day, we moved on a few miles towards base camp and camped on a small island. Campsites on the U.S. side are designated by a fire pit and a grumper, which is a fiberglass toilet over a deep hole. We were just arriving, and it was evening. One of the adult advisors needed to visit the grumper, so he walked towards it. About 2 minutes later, we heard him yelling, and he came running back to the camp, still pulling his pants up, and said that he's seen a gorilla right in front of him. I asked if maybe it was a bear, and he said absolutely not. That he'd hunted bears for years, and it was no bear. It was a monkey, and it was about 9 feet tall. At this height estimate, I'm imagining being back in my hammock. If I touched the chest and I was about 6 feet off the ground, that puts the head close to 9 feet up. Was it stalking us? Was there more than one? The boys are scared. Time to mitigate. I suggest a night paddle. No one's sleeping anymore anyway, so we packed back up and set out at around 8 p.m. and paddled by headlamp for several miles. My plan was to get back onto Moose Lake and camp very near to base so we could be the first crew off water the following day. Moose Lake is connected to Newfoundland Lake by a small pinch and a channel of water that's not very deep or wide. There's dark woods on both sides. We were right in the middle of the pinch when a rock the size of a basketball came flying out of the woods on the right side and narrowly missed the bow of the canoe I was steering. There's no cliff there. This thing was forcefully thrown at us from the tree line. At this, we paddled like hell. We paddled to the corner of Moose Lake, tied all 3 canoes together, and we set out there all night. With the sunrise, we paddled to base camp and ended our expedition. They did not want to talk about what happened, and I was okay with that. They left for Oklahoma the next day. After they left, I went to work a shift in the canoe yard, helping crews offload. My buddy Justin got back that day from a trip in the same area we had been in, and as I was helping him put a boat on the rack, I noticed he had a distant look, almost 1,000-yard stare. I asked how his trip went, and he said it was all good until they hit Knife Lake, Newfoundland Lake. He said they were being messed with for 2 nights on Knife, and then had a rock thrown at them in the Newfoundland Pinch. Sure enough, for a solid 2 weeks after that, crews kept coming back from that area with very similar stories. One night, there was a crowd of us guides in the staff lodge swapping trail stories, and these encounters came up one after another. Screams, rocks, sightings of apes. Then, from the back corner of the room, I hear a chuckle. It's one of the old veteran guides who'd been there for over a decade. All he said was, "It's about time somebody else seen one." I asked how long he'd known they were there. He said he's been encountering them for 10 years. Then he said, "They talk to me." This shocked me. "Like a language?" I asked. "No, they communicate telepathically. The less you acknowledge them, the less they'll bother you. But they can read you, and they like it when you're afraid. It's like a game to them." What happened out there is still a big question in my mind. I've always been open to the idea of Sasquatch. Their existence was never a huge stretch for me. But what really sticks with me is the way that veteran guides spoke of their intelligence and parapsychological abilities, that they can read human emotion as clear as pages in a book, that they know our species better than we know ourselves. So, this story begins like this. A friend and I were over a week ago, on the 29th of December 2022 to be exact, out in town, and later that night, we drove up to the forest, about a mile up the hill and away from my house. It was around 9 p.m. when we arrived up there. A very strange night, to be honest. The moon was visible behind the clouds and everything was really dark. We pretty much were standing for around 10 minutes next to my car, in the darkness, looking into the forest, having a smoke break. Then, the forest got more quiet. After a guy with a dog came by, nothing unusual. Well, till it got even more quiet. I then spotted some weird lights in the forest, probably half a mile up to a mile inside, between the trees. It looked like candlelight. By the way, we didn't have any snow by then for about a week or 2. I told my friend and pointed over to the lights. They just shrugged it off and told me that it was that clear. It could be a house in the distance, but it wasn't. I knew that for a fact. There was no house, just one further up the road, not over there in that forest. I knew that forest well after all. We were looking and watching for a bit until a weird feeling hit us, like we were being watched by something. Hearing some leaves rattle and some branches cracking a bit. Elsewise, those lights looked like they were coming closer. I could have sworn. I might have heard some voice from where those lights were as well, but I'm not sure. After finishing the smoke break, we got back into the car, since it felt way too eerie. I even started over and just said, "No worries, we're just visiting and come in peace. I know you are out there." My friend just glared at me like I was a madman, knowing that at least one Wendigo and some other beings roamed around in this forest. I told him the stories, by the way. Well, nothing eventful afterwards, until I went to bed that following night. I had a strange dream, very lucid. I could say astral again for what it's worth. In the dream, I was going close to the forest, looking down where that swamp was. It was a bright afternoon, middle of the winter. Snow was almost covering everything. It looked similar like these other dreams, in which a Wendigo, which I know quite well, now visited me. Speaking of, there was one. Not the one I knew. This one. This one was different. Looking like a bear skeleton with a skull. A big skull. Which looked strange. Having antlers and a half skeleton. And rotten like corpse as a body. I stared at it. It looked at me and hauled at me. The sound was deafening. And I only heard you know the sound after something loud like an explosion? It was like this, with white noise and static in my vision. A moment later, I was awake, looking around, saying only, "What the F was this?" I then turned around and went to sleep again. I fell asleep and woke up in the same dream, just down there facing this Wendigo. I was mad, just mad as hell for letting out this screech or haul. The next thing I remember was me bolting towards it, bearing some ungodly wrath, ramming my fist into its ribcage and tearing out its heart. Moments later, I saw him fall apart, letting out a screech, holding his bloody, ice-cold heart in my hand. The following part was more or less fuzzy, not sure. Did I or didn't I eat his heart? I later woke up and that was pretty much it. I'm 22 now, and this happened when I was in elementary school. I want to say I was like 9 years old. My parents took me and my younger sister camping all the time in California. My mom admits that her placement of my sister and I in this tent is really effed. If she could go back and change it, she would. The tent was set up with a space for two in the middle. Think of a square with two rectangles on the side, with a divider that splits up the rectangles on the side. So, like privacy for my sister and I. But like someone could rip the tent on my side in the night and snatch me, and they wouldn't be able to see because of the divider. Anyways, hopefully I painted a good picture there. I'm positioned where to my left is my parents sleeping, and to the right was the wilderness. I still remember the setup of this campsite, and you could see the campsites next to you, but they were distantly placed. Anyhow, I wake up and am cuddling what I think is my mama's arm. I can feel the warmth through the tent, as the divider would block me from actually touching her hand. I'm waking up out of the haze of just opening my eyes when I realize I'm facing the right direction. I remember silently freaking out, and for some reason, my kid brain, instead of flinching, I thought to move my hand around, and what I felt to confirm I'm feeling something. I didn't wake my parents up. I just laid there really scared, and I eventually passed out again. And I must have not made a big fuss about it back then because I did tell my mom, and I think she kind of brushed it off as a "you were dreaming" thing. But as time grew on, that memory stays to be one of the most vivid memories. I have, in my opinion, a really amazing memory when it comes to my past. I can remember being in a stroller, and I can remember my thoughts too at that age really clearly. It could have been so many things. I do not like to even think of all the possibilities of what it could have been. The summer of 2008 was a rough time to graduate from college. I had just spent 4 years getting a degree only to find that the job market had all but dried up. As bummed out as I was about being unemployed for the foreseeable future, I found a deep appreciation for backcountry camping and hiking that summer. Growing up in the Rocky Mountains and graduating from a college in western Montana, I was not a stranger to hiking or camping. But that summer, it became an escape to the point of an obsession. Going on daily hikes and camping beneath the stars really helped my mental health while I worried about my life's purpose and my future. It was June and unseasonably cold, wet, and cloudy. The daytime highs barely touched 50 degrees, and at night it dropped below freezing. Despite the weather, I had planned to hike around the Anaconda Range that week, and I wasn't going to let that deter me. My plan for the week, funny enough, was to hike from Storm Lake over Storm Lake Pass and down to Upper Seymour Lake. Storm Lake, actually an alpine reservoir, is a challenge to get to and requires a 4x4 pickup and some skilled driving. The road is a narrow 2-track winding its way through thick pine forests. The way was slick with rain, but I made it to the top with little heartburn. I set up camp on the north shore of the lake and decided to do some fishing. The fishing was miserable. It was cold and nothing was biting. But the best thing about bad fishing is that my thoughts were free to wander while I sat on the shore. The rain was a constant little drizzle and created a natural white noise. Time passed and my daydreams were cut short as a low rumble from up the canyon overtook the sounds of the rain. The rumbling was not unlike a distant diesel engine. There are no roads that go beyond where I was camped. No machinery or vehicles could be up that canyon. Maybe it's a plane? I thought, looking up into the rain clouds. But the sound wasn't getting closer or farther away, and the sound wasn't above me. It came from beyond the lake and up into the canyon. The sound was stationary and constant. This was most certainly not a plane, or a truck, or a bulldozer. All of this wasn't outright scary, but nonetheless, my hair stood on end while I sat there listening. After 20 minutes, the rumbling faded away, and I was left again with only the sound of raindrops. Soon enough, I caught a decent-sized trout, cleaned it, and headed back to camp to get ready for dinner. The fish cooked up fine, but to be honest, I hate trout. It's edible, sure, but totally unappetizing. They taste like mud. I ate as much as I could stand and tossed the rest into the lake. Building up my fire for the night, I sat back to enjoy the evening with a bit of whiskey. Night came fast. The mountain ridges put the sun to bed early, and the rain clouds obscured the starlight. It was dark. Really dark. The sounds of a crackling warm fire and the rain bouncing off my tent were a great comfort and started to lull me to sleep. I reminded myself I needed to build up the fire before bed. I walked over to my pile of scavenged firewood and grabbed an armful. Being away from the fire's crackling, I could pick up that all too familiar rumbling rising in the background. It was growing louder than before, and closer. I may have had a few too many pulls of whiskey and was tired and grouchy. This noise was ruining my camp trip and my buzz. Frustrated, I yelled into the blackness of the night, "Hey, shut the F up, a-hole." Like a switch being flipped, the rumbling stopped. And so did the rain. My heart skipped a beat. I realized that was not a convenient coincidence. There was an intelligence out there, something sentient, observing me and responding to my screams, and I wasn't getting the most positive vibes from it. I threw all the logs on the fire and retreated back to my tent. More on edge than ever, I just sat there, listening to the fire crackling, to my rapid breathing, and beyond that, to the silence of the darkness. Before this moment, I had felt alone, but safe. Now I felt alone and vulnerable. Beyond where the firelight faded, I felt there were a million eyes in that dark watching me. My paranoia began to subside when the rain suddenly started again. Not a drizzle, but a massive downpour. I was glad I had built up the fire, or it would have been snuffed out for sure. My tent was being pushed down by the force of the storm. I thought about bailing to the truck, but knew I'd be soaked to the bone instantly. Risking injury or death over getting wet is the kind of logic only whiskey can produce. I could feel the rainwater pooling and moving under my tent. This storm wasn't letting up. The urge to get in the pickup and drive away was ever more tantalizing. I could get my stuff tomorrow in the daylight and spend a few nights in town. But I'd had a bit too much to drink. Driving, especially on that slick, muddy 2-track road, would have been a death sentence. But I still needed a safer place to sleep than a wimpy tent. Grabbing what I could, I ripped open the tent flaps and ran for the truck. I was soaking wet by the time I settled into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Turning the heat on full blast, I hoped that would dry me out. It was going to be a miserable night, though. I reclined my chair and tried to calm my thoughts with deep breaths. The rain wasn't letting up. I was warm from the heater, and I was riding the crest of a good whiskey buzz. The fire was still raging despite the rain and kept the campsite well lit. I remember the truck's clock reading 1:06 a.m. I blinked. It was only a moment, but when I opened my eyes, the rain had stopped. It was foggy and quiet. The once raging campfire was just embers, and there was morning twilight to the east. The truck's clock now read 5:45 a.m. It was morning. That couldn't be right. Almost 5 hours gone in the blink of an eye. I must have passed out. My head was killing me. I didn't feel like I had drank that much to justify that kind of hangover. I turned off the truck and stepped out to survey the night's damage. My tent was completely flattened. The tent poles were shattered into pieces. Everything was soaking wet. Smothering the remains of the fire, I dragged all my junk to the pickup and tossed it into the bed. My hike over the pass wasn't happening today, that was for sure. It was around 6:30 a.m. before I finished packing up camp. As I climbed into the cab of the truck, I heard the rumbling again through the morning fog. I drove out of there as fast as I could down that muddy, bobsled track of a road, not once looking in the rearview mirror. I have never been back to Storm Lake, and I probably never will. My My friend Samantha and I were so excited to take a road trip together to go hiking somewhere further than home. We'd been talking about it since we graduated college a few years back and finally found the time. Well, she always made the time. It was mainly me that had trouble balancing work with anything else. Looking back now, I wished I had spent more of this trip focusing on Sam, the scenery, and being present in the moment. I wished I had been a better friend. Sam was the most excited for our trip. The week before we left, she was texting me about restaurants in the area, stuff to do. She made a Spotify list with both of our favorites, so we could listen to 7 hours worth of an eclectic mix of classic rock, pop, and black metal, and was making trailheads we might enjoy on our Google Maps app. I felt bad for putting the trip off for so long. We got to catch up, explore, try cool food. We had a great trip up until our final hike. We're both in decent shape, and since we had the supplies and plenty of daylight, we decided we were going to try a longer, unpaved trail that went around this beautiful lake. It was the last hike of our trip, and we decided to take a more difficult and less crowded trail. Initially, it was a wonderful hike. The water was such a surreal shade of blue, and the pine trees and rolling hills were breathtaking. The air was thinner than we were used to, but so refreshing. As we hiked around one bend, I almost ran right into Sam's back. I had been falling behind, focusing on placing my feet in exactly the right locations in the soft dirt, so I didn't go sliding down 20 feet to the shore. Sam stood frozen, a deer in front of her blocking the trail. As I approached with my backpack jingling and breathing heavily, the deer stood for a moment more, tilting its head sideways at me before darting back into the pines. She looked back at me, her face tight. "Did you see that?" "The deer? Yeah, it was pretty magical." She gave a little laugh as she started up again so we could both move on to the section of the trail that had sturdier footing. "No, I mean something was wrong with the deer. It was way too comfortable around me, and I don't know if you could see or hear it, but it was drooling and making these weird sounds." We continued on in silence after that as we focused on our footing and the scenery, stopping every so often to take pictures. One time, when we were stopped, we heard rustling to our right, higher up on the hill. I got the bear spray out and held on to it. It seemed to be walking parallel to us, roughly matching our pace. It sounded big, too. Eventually, the hiking trail rose to meet the higher part of the hill, and I couldn't help but sigh in relief. I'd been so worried I'd roll my ankle and tumble down the mountain. So it was good to have more room so I wasn't walking right on the edge. Back in college, I'd sprained my ankle badly but couldn't afford to see a doctor. It healed a bit oddly, and since then, my left ankle has been iffy. After a while, I needed to sit for a moment, walking uphill for an hour in addition to the 6,500-foot elevation. I was struggling. Maybe I'm also a bit more out of shape than I had been willing to admit to. Sam sat with me for a moment, but then saw some wildflowers about 10 feet into the woods and left to take a quick picture. With her gone, I felt a sudden chill. Something was watching me. "Sam?" I called out nervously as the rustling grew louder, and I gripped my container of bear spray tightly. It stepped out of the woods, and it was just a deer. or more specifically, it was the deer, the same one that Sam and I had encountered. Now that she had pointed it out, I could see what she was saying. The deer had no issues approaching me. It was scrawny, walked slowly, but like it had a bit too much to drink, and it was definitely drooling. I jumped up and waved my arms at it to go away. I knew it was sick, and the poor thing was confused and probably suffering, but it creeped me the hell out. It cocked its head and seemed to be studying me, looking me up and down. It approached me and made some sort of gasping sound. It was opening and closing its mouth in a way which deeply unsettled me for some reason. Sam! She came running towards me from the woods, and when I turned back, it had gone. Are you okay? What happened? The creepy deer was back. I know it sounds silly, but I think it's been following us, I told her. I told her how it had been behaving. Do you think it's rabid? Poor baby, she said sympathetically. Possibly, or I wonder if it has CWD. Either way, we should probably let the park rangers know just in case. We had decided we'd stick together, but after a few miles, she ended up ahead of me again. She tends to inch forward to get pictures, whereas I tend to walk past sites, then have regrets and double back to take pictures. I had walked back a bit and was sitting down, angling my phone weirdly to try and fit the scene in front of me in the frame when I heard Sam's voice, but I couldn't make out what she was saying. Hey, I'll be right there, I said, my voice raised slightly, assuming she was talking to me. Then she screamed. Sam! I stood up and tried to walk as quickly and carefully as possible. Her screaming changed from fear to agony, and it sounded like she was sobbing. I wasn't sure what happened, but I could tell she was scared and likely hurt. I suddenly realized I was still holding our only canister of bear spray. Against my better judgment, I started running as fast as I could, and for a while I was making good time. And then my left foot landed a patch of soft dirt at the edge of the trail. My ankle rolled and I was falling. I don't remember hitting the ground, but I remember opening my eyes, flat on my back, about 15 feet below where I had been standing. It was also dark outside. We'd started hiking at least 6 to 7 hours before sunset. I tried to stand, but it was a struggle. I was confused, disoriented. Trying to get up was taking all my energy and focus. I had a deep feeling of dread I couldn't explain. As I started slowly moving upwards on my hands and knees, I tried to recall what had happened leading up to my fall. Sam sounded hurt. She was screaming. I had run after her, and then I fell. Crap. Sam. I called her name, my voice hoarse but no response. My phone was surprisingly only minorly damaged, but I had no reception. Luckily, since it had been buckled to me, I still had our backpack. I dug through it. We had first aid kits, but I figured I could patch myself up later. I didn't want to stay down here any longer than I had to. I found my knife and my headlamp. After about 20 minutes, I had slowly and painfully ascended back towards where I had fallen from. My hands were raw and I could feel my right knee bleeding through my pants. I was trying to go slowly since I trusted my feet even less now, and dizziness was starting to creep in. but panic and fear drove me forward. Once I made it back to the trail, I had to sit for a moment. I heard rustling behind me and felt a sudden pang of fear. Something, or someone, had injured Sam, and here I was sitting alone injured, with my back to the woods, in the dark. I tried calling her name, in case it was her that I heard. No response. I stood up and started limping as quickly as possible towards the direction that I had last heard her scream. Luckily, the ground had evened out, because I could feel myself weaving unsteadily. I knew that something terrible may have happened to her, but kept trying to keep that thought out of my mind. As my calls to her remained unanswered, and it became harder to imagine a scenario in which she was okay, I felt my throat tighten and tears roll down my cheeks. I kept looking for her. I knew she wouldn't just leave me here. I think part of me knew then that she was gone. She would have been searching for me if she was okay, and even if she left to get help, I think they would have found me by then. Somehow, eventually, I navigated my way to where I thought she had been lost. I was hoping maybe if she was injured, she was okay, and just out of it and confused like I was. My foot caught in the mud and I fell. Lights flashed behind my eyelids and I felt overcome with nausea. The light from my headlamp had greatly dimmed, as it was now coated in mud and grime. I heard movement behind me. As the smell hit me, I realized the mud and dirt mixed with blood. I could taste it, mixed with the gritty texture. Leaves covered with what was likely blood stuck to my face, and I felt something soft and wet under my shoulder. The rustling behind me became discernible as footsteps. I felt around for my knife, my bear spray, but instead felt something hard, sticky. I was certain I had just found out what happened to Sam, and had a good guess at what was about to happen to me. I felt no urge to get up as the footsteps got closer. I knew I couldn't outrun it. I closed my eyes trying to focus on something, anything else, not knowing if I wanted to see what was coming for me. The footsteps stopped, and I could hear labored breathing coming from above me. I waited, and then, as no blows came, I opened my eyes. It was Sam. She stood over me, breathing heavily from her mouth. She was covered in blood. Her shirt and pants were torn, but she was alive. I let out a relieved sob, and then could no longer hold back the tears. "Oh my God," I whispered, as I slowly moved to sitting and then standing. "I thought I had lost you." I pulled her close to me into a hug. She stood motionless, her arms at her side. She stuck to me where her shirt was still a bit wet. Dried blood covered the neck of her shirt and her midsection. Her hands and, unsettlingly, her mouth were also smeared with blood. I could still hear her breathing heavily close to my ear. "What happened?" I asked as I released her. She stared at me but didn't respond. I figured she was a bit traumatized. Frankly, I wasn't sure how she was up and standing at all after whatever had happened. She was a bit wobbly, but otherwise seemed to be able to walk. As we walked towards the car, she fell behind me, which made me nervous, as I didn't want to let her out of my sight. She kept stopping, staring over her shoulder, while I tried to coax her forward. Eventually, after what felt like forever, We made it back. My ankle was killing me, but I had tried to move as fast as possible. Although the woods were eerily silent, I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. When we got to the car, I was debating if we should drive ourselves to the hospital or call 911. I had this feeling of terror that I couldn't shake. I pictured us making it all the way here to the car and then something breaking the windows, attacking us. I decided we needed to leave now. "Do you have your keys? Do you think you can drive?" I asked. She had an old Jeep pickup and was very sensitive about other people driving her baby. Plus, I wasn't sure I could drive us with my ankle as it was. She said nothing. She cocked her head at me. "I know we look like we've been mauled by a bear." I caught myself and winced, feeling suddenly insensitive. She clearly had been attacked by something or someone. When she said nothing, displayed no emotion or reaction, I cautiously continued. "But I have a bad feeling I think we need to leave, like right now. I'd rather call for help when we're back on the main road or just drive straight to the hospital." She remained motionless, staring back into the woods, and I wondered if she lost her keys in whatever struggle she had. Luckily, I had her spare with me. I unlocked the doors and she continued to stand outside. I realized I would need to punish my ankle a bit more because she was far too out of it to drive. I slid in, but she remained motionless. "Sam, get in, please. Something is out there still. Please." She was licking her lips, staring back at me again. In the darkness, her blue eyes looked almost black. I leant back out of the seat and opened her door for her and had to guide her in. I buckled her in after she made no move to do so for herself. As we drove and the headlights of passing cars illuminated the interior, I kept checking on her out of the corner of my eye. She was breathing in and out of her mouth and staring at me. I noticed now, in the better light, that she was drooling. "Hey, how are you doing?" No response, but she began opening and closing her mouth and making a wet gasping sound as she breathed in and out. Her breath reeked and her teeth were tinged pink. I don't have much medical knowledge, but I was worried she had a punctured lung due to the strange sounds she was making. "Hold tight. We're about 20 minutes from the hospital." Despite my ankle, I drove as fast as I could. We made it in 10. As we pulled up, I helped guide her out of the car and walked behind her, steadying her. I noticed something. Her shirt was on inside out. It hadn't been this morning. Likely because of how we looked, they found rooms for us immediately in the ER. I had a bad sprain and a concussion and would need a few stitches, but it felt so good just to be out of those woods. I asked the nurse that came to check on me about how Sam was doing. I mentioned to him I'm not sure if she was attacked by an animal or a person. I mentioned what I had noticed about her shirt, and that we may have encountered a sick animal, in case any of that helped. When he returned, he was clearly distressed. Sam was gone. She hadn't appeared to be outworldly injured, strangely, but they had wanted to assess for internal trauma. However, the first moment they had left her alone, she had just walked out, judging by the bloody footprints. It's been weeks and I haven't seen Sam since. Her mom hasn't either. She has been working with the police out here. They think Sam has a head wound and is just confused and will turn up in town eventually. But a few days ago, I heard on the news that a partial skeleton was found on the trail we were on. Likely the victim of an animal attack, they said. And due to the condition of the body, they were asking for leads so they could use dental records to help identify the victim. This might sound crazy, but I think it's her they found. I don't know how to explain it, but I don't think Sam ever left those woods that night. It's my fault, and I don't know what that thing was that I drove into town. If you live in southern Colorado, please be safe. I am so sorry. And that concludes tonight's 8 true Backwoods creepy stories. I hope you are sleeping well. Until the next time, I hope you wake up a better and stronger person. I'll read to you soon.